Well, it's an honor to be making this presentation, and I'm going to now share my screen, and you never know, I might manage to do it right. So let's have a look. Yeah. Okay.
Sasha, we can clearly see this. Thank you.
Good. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the interaction between physical spaces, which is a very sort of practical and almost hard thing, and the dynamic issue of pupils and their learning, which is a quite soft thing, really, and quite hard to get to grips with. So it's the interaction between those two different worlds, I suppose, and that's a really interesting and important issue, I think, because we build schools and they're a building project and they create spaces and all those types of things, but actually if they don't support the learning process, then really we've missed the point. And so what I'm really talking about is, yes, we're going to spend quite a lot of money on building schools and the like, but let's spend it really well so that we maximize out on the positive impact on the learning process. And that might not sound like an obvious thing, but actually it's quite usual for people to get distracted into planning issues and aesthetic issues and architectural statements and all those types of things. And I'm not so interested in those. What I'm really interested in is the fundamental impact of the characteristics of the learning spaces on the learning process of the children that actually spend a lot of their time within those schools. So that's the focus I'm going to take. And I'm going to occasionally look above the screen. So that would look strange to you, but it's because I'm seeing Russian, which doesn't, I have to say, mean much to me. And I just have to sometimes see the English translation. So don't think that I'm going off on some sort of reverie. So what I want to do first is to look really broadly before I get into any detail, because for me, you have to put the learner at the center of any analysis. And so that's what I've done with this diagram. And then around them, the learning environment is made up of something to do with where they are, who they're with, and how they're being taught. And so it's some combination of those things, and they get discussed a lot, and they involve things like, of course, learning spaces, like pedagogy, like teachers and other people actually teaching pupils. It could be other pupils within the same classroom. And all of those things need to be taken into account. But it's impossible in some ways to do that. And so we're focusing on the learning environment, the physical learning environment, but trying to remember all the time that actually it connects, it has to be seen in the context of those other aspects, the pedagogy and the teachers and all of that, but focusing on that one area. And then there's another big caveat, which is that I'm talking about you have an experience from the UK, from Western Europe, and also work in the Philippines. I've just got back from the Philippines, and it's very evident that these ideas have to be applied very differently in different contexts. And so I'll be talking about things which I've got evidence for in one context, so I'm sure about them. But for you to use them in your context, you need to think, what are the principles and how would that apply differently here? Because your culture could be different, your climate could be different, your technology that you'd be utilizing could be different. And so in a sense, whatever I say is a starting point for you to think, oh, that's interesting. Does that really apply here? How would we interpret it in our context? And that's something I can't do for you, but I'm hoping to stimulate you with some things which I'm sure are important and need to be thought about. So we're going to have a fairly extensive tour of some ideas, and the question is, which direction do we go? And the first direction I want to go is actually looking broader. So taking it from the very specific thing about a child in a classroom, what I'll be doing first is looking for quite a long while at the classroom design itself on a big study that we did. It took 12 person years to do, and it had some quite clear results, which was a relief actually, because we put a lot of effort in over a lot of time. And that's the Clever Classrooms, or the HEAD project, which I'll be talking about. And then beyond that, I've also been involved in a European Commission project looking at the perspective of people who have responsibility for all of the schools in a country or a region, or at least several schools, and how they might manage their infrastructure over the longer term. So we did a study of 27 countries and got out some good practice ideas from that. And then I'm going to shoot off in the other direction, which is to say, okay, so what are classrooms in use like? So it's all very well building these spaces, but what happens when people get in them? And then I'm going to specifically touch on the teacher perspective, but very quickly, to see how the classroom looks from their view compared with my researcher's view or a designer's view. And then I'm going to finish on a case study that I did of an intervention where the classroom was changed and we monitored the impacts on the children. So on the right-hand side, we're going more into the dynamics of what happens in a classroom, at the other extreme in a way, from standing back and trying to manage the infrastructure for a whole country. So that's the ground I'm going to cover. I'm going to do it fairly quickly, but I hope it doesn't become confusing. I'll keep this map up occasionally just to actually show where we are. So first of all, we're looking at the classroom as a whole, a holistic view of the classroom and its impact of its physical characteristics on the learning of the pupils in it. And for this, I'm drawing on the HEAD project, that's Holistic Evidence and Design. It was funded by the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council in the UK. When we did it, it cost about £500,000 to do, and it took us, as I say, 12 person years to carry out. So it was a big study. And what we were trying to do was to find, not assuming anything, if there was a connection between the physical characteristics of learning spaces and the progress of the children in those spaces. We chose primary schools because in the UK, the children spend a whole year in one space, and they've got good metrics of where they start academically and where they finish. So it's like a good natural experiment. If there's going to be an impact of that classroom, it should show up over a year, and we've got some measure of a very important thing, which of course is learning progress. We did studies looking at other aspects before, but actually learning progress seems to be really important to people, to society, and to everything. So we decided to focus on this occasion on that particular thing. We started in what might seem to you quite a surprising place. And we started actually about 5 years before we did the study with a question, which is, how do we experience space? How do we experience a physical space? And we sort of did a thought experiment and said, at its most basic point, it must be by a person absorbing things through their senses from the space and then interpreting it in their brain. So it's really quite a simple idea that actually we needed to try and work out what does that mean? What sort of things come through your senses and what sort of reaction does your brain actually give? And after about 3 years, we came up with this model, which is a fairly radical model. It's a model which sets out some principles for spaces and how we experience them. We know that the brain can't cope with all the data that comes into it from the spaces around it. And so it's very often an intuitive response to a space, and it's to do with naturalness. So these are all the normal things, the naturalness things that are measured: heat, light, sound, and air quality. You can get meters and you can measure all these things, and so they've been measured a lot over the years. But we also added to that, through our analysis, with a lot of different experts supporting us in this, we added 2 other aspects: individualization, and this is about an individual's preferences that they've built up over their life. And the most silly example I can think is that I went to a secondary school that I wasn't very pleased about, happy with, and they had a particular green for their uniform, and so I react to a particular way to that green. Somebody else wouldn't. And so we all have individual reactions to things in the space around us, so we included that. And then we also included the appropriate level of stimulation as an aspect, which for learning was something that needed to be looked at and taken into account as well. So this in 2010 was a proposition that these are the important things, and that we're going well beyond just the usual naturalness factors that have been considered. And we then took that into the project and applied it, if you like, to a large survey of schools. So we're talking about 27 schools, 153 classrooms, 3,766 pupils, and we knew which classroom each pupil was in, And so we could match up the pupil, the classroom, the characteristics of the classroom, the progress that the children made. And that meant that we had a situation where we could really make that connection. And this is fairly unusual. Most people have studied whole schools and whole school populations, and this drilled right down to the specific spaces that the children were in and the characteristics that those spaces had, which we measured extensively. You can see that the schools aren't particularly special schools. We didn't choose good ones or bad ones. What we went for was diversity in age, diversity in type of building, diversity in the success of the school. We just tried to factor in as much variation as possible because we were doing an exploratory study where we're trying to understand what was going on. And for that, you need diversity. So these weren't good or bad schools. They were pretty average but varied schools within the UK from all different eras. And the finding we got, so I'm going straight to that, and I'll then go back to the detail of the characteristics of the spaces. But the finding we got was that the physical variations in the physical characteristics of the spaces those children were in explained 16% of the variation in their learning progress over a year. And this was learning in reading, writing, and maths averaged. And we thought that was much bigger than we expected, to be honest. We expected it to be 1 or 2%, and we expected it to be for decades and for thousands of pupils and so important. But actually 16% is a huge impact when you take into account that 70% of the variation in learning progress attaches to the characteristics of the children themselves. And we were able to distinguish that from this effect of the classroom through multi-level modeling, because we had children in spaces in schools, and it means that you can actually distinguish what's happening at which level in the analysis. So this is a really big effect. This is basically saying, after you've accounted for the children and their characteristics and their socioeconomic background and so on, which we could separate out, after you've accounted for that, this and teacher quality pretty much explain the rest of the variation. And this factor, the impact of the physical spaces, is pretty much as big as the effect of teacher quality, which is astounding, really. And we think the reason for that is that it's actually something that people don't think about. It's just something that's in the background, and it's not actively used. So you'll have heard of the idea of the third teacher, which is where the actual physical space is actively used to actually support learning. And this is saying, yeah, and there's a really big opportunity to do that. And if you do it well, it can have a huge impact on the success of the children. I mentioned the model looking at naturalness and individualization and level of stimulation. I mentioned that it was a proposition in 2010. We didn't know if those things were important. This was a theoretical development of this model. So we were testing it out with these schools in the UK. And it could have been that there was a silver bullet. There was one thing that was going to be really, really important. And we didn't find that. We found a really interesting thing, which is that pretty much everything is important to a degree. And so you can see the green things are the naturalness factors, and they account for 49% of the impact. But those other two things, level of stimulation and individualization, so the red is the stimulation and the blue is the individualization, they account for about a quarter each. And so together they're as important as those easy to measure, often studied things. And so that was really quite an astounding finding, and it raises a really interesting design challenge for any designer, really, which is that somehow you need to subtly include these aspects in your design. And if you can do that successfully, if you can empower teachers through the spaces you're given to them, then they can actually really make a difference. There's another aspect which comes from sort of science, if you like, of diminishing returns, economics, it sounds like, diminishing returns, or the 80-20 rule, which is that the lesson of this particular slide is not to concentrate on any one aspect too much, but to actually get the quick gains on every front that you can first, and then you get all your 80% of the 80-20 rule straight away, and then you can work harder to get the rest, but actually it's better to move on to something else and get the benefit from that. So this was an interesting slide for us anyway, because it's got real lessons about how those factors all actually contribute, and pretty equally at that. So I'm going to move on now and look at some of the particular areas and the practicalities of them. So we actually were doing a very practical project. We were measuring real things that people can do real things about. They can make real changes about them. So this is light, air quality and temperature. Links to nature as well, but that didn't come out in the analysis at a very strong level, and nor did acoustics. And I need to say something about acoustics because I've been beaten up by so many acousticians at meetings where they say, but acoustics has to be important. And the thing is, in the UK, we have carpets on the floors, we have acoustic tiles on the ceiling, and we have quite a lot of display material on the walls, and the acoustics aren't a problem, generally speaking. So for our particular context, this is one of these things which may be different somewhere else. In our context, acoustics wasn't problematic. And my stock answer now to acousticians is, well, you've done a good job. You've actually managed to persuade us what to do, and we've done it, and now acoustics isn't a problem. And that's the reality in the UK, pretty much. But if you had a space which had hard surfaces on the floor, the ceiling, the walls, you would get an echoey space that was difficult to deal with. And I'm not denying that that's a possibility. But we're looking at light, air quality, and temperature here. So light's an important aspect. It was actually the biggest factor. And here we're talking about access to natural daylighting is important. This is for two reasons. One, because it gives you light that you can read and work by. But the other reason for natural daylighting is that it gives you a sense of the time of day. Your circadian rhythms and everything can actually be stimulated, and you have a feeling of being connected with the world. And everybody in the literature would actually say that seems to be a really important thing. So natural lighting, yes, very important, but not glare. So you have to try and get the good stuff without getting the glare from it. And also artificial lighting is important, because there are times of day, of course, or times of year where you need good quality artificial lighting to be able to do your work as well. And I put a slide in there showing the a room from our study where you can see that if you didn't think daylighting is important, you might put a whole load of shelves and cupboards and everything against the window and lose the daylighting. The moment you know that it's really important for learning, then as a teacher, you'd never do that. And so this is an awareness thing, which it's all very easy to say once you know, but until you do, you can do some silly things, which turn out to be things you can change, things you can do differently. So that's daylighting. We now move on to air quality. Air quality is something where obviously in the UK, because we've got a fairly benign climate, you can use natural ventilation. And for us, it's having windows with openings at different heights opposite each other, ideally, so that you can get cross ventilation. And if you can do that, then probably you can actually get quite good results. But if you don't do that, then the air quality can become pretty bad pretty quickly, and that can have a very profound effect on people's capacity to learn, because their brains don't work so well without fresh air. So we did a bit of a calculation as to how long it would take for air quality to go from good to bad within a classroom with 30 children for us, 55 square meters. They're just sitting there, not doing anything. They're just breathing. And the answer was 30 minutes. So if a teacher in our context didn't do anything within 30 minutes, and a class is usually more like an hour, the lesson is more like an hour long. If they don't do anything within 30 minutes, then the air quality will be poor. So they actually need to take action to ensure that doesn't happen. And the difficulty with air quality is that it sneaks up on you. It becomes worse. Excuse me. It becomes worse slowly over time. And people just become a bit soporific, a bit dozy, and they don't really realize why it is. Again, the moment you know that this is a potential problem, then you'd do something about it. You'd open a window or whatever. I've behaved differently since knowing this. If I go into a lecture room to do a lecture in a university, and if it's a bit stuffy in there, I notice it and I immediately go and open the windows and get the lighting right and try and create the best conditions for people to actually be alert and receptive to what I'm trying to say to them. Having known this, we actually got one of our postgrads to track over the days of a week the CO2 in one classroom. And these are the CO2 levels. CO2 is not a poison, it's a surrogate measure of air quality. And really, the ambient level is 500 parts per million. You can see there at the bottom. And then the limit's supposed to be about 1,000 for schools, 1,000 parts per million. And then some people are pushing that up a bit to 1,500. They're saying that's okay, really, because actually it's quite difficult to keep it down to 1,000 sometimes. And it's not really at all okay, because people's capacity to function diminishes linearly from 500 parts per million onwards. So you're already losing quite a bit, allowing 1,000. And you can see in this school, they were getting up to 2,500 parts per million mid-afternoon, when the classroom had been in use for much of the day and it had built up a lot. It dropped a bit at lunchtime, but really high in the afternoon. And you can see at the bottom right there, there's all the impacts that has on reaction times and concentration and everything. So you're teaching pupils who really, are being, I don't know, really just a bit stifled of something they really need, oxygen, for their brains to work. You can see on this diagram, there are 2 lines at the bottom where the air quality is fantastic. And if we were talking to each other face to face, I'd say, what do you think those are? But of course, I can't do that. So I'm going to tell you which is there Saturday and Sunday. No pupils in the school, and the air quality is fantastic, of course. So it gives you an idea of this is the pupil breathing in the classrooms. It will fill the classroom up with CO2. It will diminish the quality of the air. You have to do something about it if you want them to learn. Okay, let's move on to temperature. This is one that varies a lot from country to country because of different climates. You'll probably know that children, or people, I suppose, but children in particular, like the temperature to be between something like 18 degrees and 22 degrees C. Boys like it a bit cooler, girls like it a bit warmer. Adults, this is teachers, like it warmer, children like it colder, but this is all, within a degree or two. And so if the temperature can be kept within those parameters, that's fine. What we looked at in our study was the controllability of the temperature at the level of the classroom. And we've got some schools in the UK where they've got really fancy centralized heating systems, but no control at the local level. And we found really big variations in temperature in those classrooms. And so control is the main thing. And also controlling heat gain from, for us anyway, south-facing windows, where if you put the blinds down, that doesn't stop the heat coming in. It's through the glass by then. You need external shading. And you can see on the right-hand picture there, they've got a big overhanging eaves there, providing a covered area for the children to play in. This is for young children, this particular school. And also providing external shading from the sun, which means you don't get this problem of heat gain. So again, very practical things, completely doable, but if you don't deal with them, the classroom becomes really uncomfortable. Okay, so the next thing, this is my granddaughter, by the way, the next thing we're moving on to is individualization. This is one of these factors that doesn't tend to get measured and is quite difficult to measure, but children are very much individuals. And so it is something that, if you can, you should take into account. And we did that through looking at flexibility and ownership. We felt if there's flexibility, they'd have choice, and the odds are they could get what they wanted out of the classroom with the teacher, of course. And if there was the issue of ownership, then they would actually feel connected to the classroom and comfortable in the classroom. And I'm going to talk about those a bit now. But if you remember, this accounted for about 1/4 of the impact on learning progress. So the first thing is flexibility and choice. And we had lots of different classrooms, lots of different sized classrooms. Everybody wanted us to find out that big classrooms were better than small classrooms and that they needed to be bigger. We didn't find that. Classrooms in the UK for 30 children are somewhere between 55 and 65 square meters. And actually, that didn't seem to be problematic in itself. So that was very disappointing for a lot of designers who wanted big schools to be the order of the day. But what we did find was that this is the only thing that varied by age. For younger children, for us, that's called Key Stage 1. So these are sort of 5 to 7 year olds. a classroom that had lots of nooks and things in it seemed to work well. So a complex shape, which enabled lots of learning zones to be created, because in our academic practice, our teaching practice in the UK, they do learning by playing predominantly, and they use a lot of different spaces in different ways, a wet area, a dressing up area, maybe a reading space, various different activities go on. And to have a classroom that had nooks and crannies actually made that something which was possible to do really authentically. When the children got bigger, key stage 2, getting more on to ultimately 10 or 11 years old, then the education in our case, the pedagogy becomes more formal. Doesn't have to, but it does in our case. And there, having a really complicated space was really quite difficult, because you couldn't all connect and see the board or whatever they were doing in that sort of scenario. So it varied by age in this particular case. But what was consistent was that actually it was really helpful if a space had a breakout zone. If there was a small space associated with the big classroom where something different could be going on. And it also helped a lot, again, in our UK practice, to have a decent amount of wall space so that this could be used for displays. I don't know what happens in your country and your practice, but it's quite easy to end up with very little wall space, because you've got doors for cupboards and for coming in, you've got windows, you've got other furniture, and if you're not careful, you run out of space to put displays, and displays are used very actively in the UK as part of the teaching approach. So that's flexibility and choice, quite simple things we were looking at. Subsequently, we've come across a school that we looked at. No, actually, this was before. This is a study we did before, and it just resonated with what we found, where we looked at 2 classrooms. One on the left is an open plan classroom. The one on the right is a smaller cellular classroom, but with a shared activity area with another classroom to the right-hand side in blue there. And we asked the teachers which is flexible, and we expected them to say the open plan one on the left was flexible, but actually what the teachers said was the opposite of what we expected. They said, no, the open plan space isn't flexible, because we can't do different things in different areas, because they interact and interrupt each other. And there's a lot of dead space shown in pink there, which is really difficult to use. And so in reality, it's quite an awkward space. We can only use the yellow area, and we can't do different activities. Whereas in the cellular space, this was the opposite of what we expected. We've got a classroom for the main activity, but we've also got this activity area if we've got problem children, or children who are progressing very fast, or children who are just doing something different. They can go into that space and do that different activity without it disrupting the main classroom. So this for me is a lesson really, which is, I think you should be careful, one should be careful not to say open and flexible, thinking that it is an automatically logical phrase. So there's a lot of talk about open plan spaces. Don't assume they're flexible. They could be if they're designed well, but people are moving more towards talking about agile spaces now, where there are different areas connected and you can do different things in those areas, and together they make up a complex, interesting space. But they're not just a vast open space, which sometimes isn't as good as it looks. So it's just really to put your notice about open and flexible. I hear that as a phrase quite a lot, and I don't really believe in it anymore. One of the classic flexible schools that people may have visited, I've certainly visited it, and it's really interesting in Denmark. I think it's in Denmark. Yeah, Denmark. Hellerup School. So you'll have seen the Hellerup steps, those great big steps with little steps next to them that people use as a sort of amphitheatre. Well, this is a picture of Hellerup School, and the children are all studying quite in a free flow way in different parts of the school. And you might wonder how that works, and people have tried to emulate it. The thing you have to do is go right back to that initial diagram I said, where you have to link the pedagogy with the space. And here, their pedagogy is supported by a really sophisticated real-time system that keeps track of how the children are doing. And so although the space is loose, the systems are very tight. And together they actually provide an environment where you just don't have anarchy going on and people getting lost in the system and going off the rails. So this is an interesting space, but you have to take the system that goes with it if you're going to try and do that sort of thing. And so when you're looking at these spaces, don't just think, what a fun space. You have to think, how would it work? And for them, it works with this really careful tracking system for the individual children. Ownership then. So this was one of the harder things to measure. We decided to look at the nature of the furniture and everything. Was it really child-centric? Was it appropriate age as well for the children that were in that space? This isn't always the case. And then we also looked for signs of ownership. So we literally went around looking at the display material on the wall, and we were looking, is that done by the teacher or is that done by the children? And if it was done by the children, we saw that as a sign of ownership. Did they have their names on their drawers? Did they have their names on their where they sat or something like that? Were there things which actually indicated that this wasn't an anonymous space, but that this was a space that really belonged to them as children? It was their space. And so the easiest way to exemplify this is to say the opposite. A space that was just an anonymous box wouldn't display any ownership. A space where you walked in and it had to be your classroom. It couldn't be any other space because you looked around as a child and saw your work, and there were distinctive features about it, really important. I'm going to give you an image of a rather extreme version of this, which is one of the classrooms that we came across, which stuck in our minds. And this was one where the children, out of cardboard boxes, made the tree in the doorway, so the adults had to duck to get in, actually. And as you went into that classroom, you could be in no doubt that it was your classroom, that it was only your classroom. It couldn't be any other, because they'd done that work, and it was really quite unusual. And so in the UK, we're now seeing actually quite a lot of people doing class-made displays outside on a table outside the classroom. So as you approach it, you get the feeling of, yeah, this is our space. We recognize it. We feel comfortable. We did some sub-analysis by subject of the data, and this really impacts strongly on maths. And maths is a subject where some people are really nervous about it. And so being in a space, we're guessing now, because this wasn't hypothesis-led, whereas the rest of the work was, we're guessing that perhaps being in a space where you feel comfortable and where you feel at ease helps in a sort of subject where quite a lot of people feel quite nervous and under attack. So that's ownership. I got another insight on ownership, and this did come in a study after the main one, where we had the opportunity to interview small children. So these were about 6-year-olds and 7-year-old children, and we asked them the question, which is your favorite space in the school? And we had no idea what they were going to say, but they kept talking about the den, they kept talking about the cave, and we thought, what are these things? Take us to them, show us what they are. And the interesting thing is that the den isn't really a very impressive space from an adult point of view. What it was cardboard on the floor, a whiteboard they could do what they wanted with. They had materials in the shelves to the right there, and they could pull those over the top and make a roof over the space. And they could basically own it and do what they liked with it. They could actually knock it around and change it. And so that made us think, that's interesting. Now we're talking about spaces which aren't perfectly finished off. And they told us another space, which was this cave, which actually the bottom on the right-hand side, which is the bottom of a staircase. And there we couldn't imagine why they found that interesting, but they sort of hid in there when they were playing hide and seek. And it made us think you have to be careful when you try and second guess what children will find good. And in the same school, there were some very, very polished spaces which the children didn't use at all. And it made us think maybe you need to create half-made spaces that provide potential for the children to do things with them, rather than spaces that are completely finished and look really smart from an adult point of view. So that's just raising a question in terms of, when to stop designing, when to stop trying to finish things off. Level of stimulation then. This was another of those new factors, if you like, that tends to get left out. It was hard to measure. We did it by individuals making a visual assessment and then comparing with others until we calibrated and could do it consistently. We're looking at visual complexity here, how complex is the shape of the space essentially, and the color in the room as another source of stimulation. You'll know that the literature on this is really contested. At the time we did this study, the Shanghai approach was becoming popular, and this is where you declutter the space and you make it calm and empty, and that means the children can concentrate. Other people were saying, no, a space, excuse me, a space has to be stimulating. So there was no clear answer on this from the literature, so we were able to use our data to come to some sort of conclusion. So this is the visual complexity. Here we've got quite a simple space, and this is driven to a fair extent by the amount of display material on the wall. Here's a slightly more complicated space in the middle, or a slightly more stimulating space. And on the right-hand side, we've got a space which is really quite exciting. And we were able to put the learning progress against these three levels and say, what shape does it take? Does it go up to the right, or does it go up to the left, Shanghai approach, or what? And as it turns out, it's a curvilinear thing. It peaks in the middle. So now we think in terms of classrooms not being too boring or too exciting, but somewhere in the middle. We're talking about ambient level of stimulation. This is what they're surrounded by all the time, and it shouldn't be too chaotic and sort of overexciting. It shouldn't be too boring and dragging them down. It should be somewhere in the middle. And that was really quite a very clear finding, which we didn't know, and I don't think anybody else knew until we did this study. So that's something where now you can look at your classroom and you can think, oh, should I be making it a bit more interesting, or should I be making it a bit less busy looking? Same thing with the color. And this is an interesting area because it's the difference between preference and functional performance. When it comes to color, children do prefer brighter colors. I mean, they don't really like completely primary colors, but they display a preference for brighter colors. But actually, if you went to the right-hand side there and did a classroom like that, functionally, in terms of learning, it's not the best. You need to be somewhere in the middle where these other two slides are, where the color is either a bright, small area of color in the recess there on the left hand of the two in the middle, or it's a whole wall, maybe the teaching wall as they call it, which is less bright but on a bigger area. And it's not something which is just a white box. And lots of classrooms we came across are white, and we did ask some headmasters why this was. And they said, but it's uncontentious. Nobody argues about it. Whereas if you start getting into colours, it becomes a nightmare. And so there is a tendency to go for the simple solution and just paint classrooms white. But you're missing an opportunity to just get that appropriate level of stimulation into the space. And if you can do that, that's what we'd recommend. So just go back one. Those are all those factors. They're the sin factors. I've been through those. They're practical things. They're things that a teacher can often change the next day if they want. So the display material, maybe if they can get a paintbrush out, they can change the color, I don't know, but they're not difficult things to change. They can definitely change the air quality in the UK if they've got the capacity to open a window. So they can control the heat. They've got all sorts of practical things that they could suddenly say, this classroom is my classroom too as a teacher. I'm going to make sure it's as good as it can be to support the learning progress and to make my life easy, to make it easy to teach these children so that they can progress and succeed. There are some massive things which were left out, and this was really frustrating as a researcher because we put a huge effort into measuring things at the school level. And we looked at the playgrounds and how good they were, the quality of the play sets and how good they were. We looked at the area of the school, the size of the school, the number of pupils. We looked at the design and the facade, whether it was really, you know, exciting or whatever. We looked at the complexity of the layout, and all of these things dropped out of the analysis as not being important compared with the particular classroom that the children were in. And this is partly because in the UK, as I said before, primary school children spend all their time in that one classroom pretty much. And they often enter that classroom directly from the outside. They don't go through the front entrance of the school. And so I suppose we shouldn't have been surprised, but this lot all dropped out of the analysis, completely outcompeted by the importance of the classroom. And there is actually another reason for this, which we didn't realize till we dug deeper, and it's exemplified by this slide. So this slide is looking at 10 schools in one of the areas we looked at. So these columns of dots are the 10 schools. The dots in the columns, say this pink one, they're showing the individual classrooms in that school and its predicted impact on learning from the model we then had. And you can see the variation within that one school in the quality of the classrooms for learning is huge. And so one of the reasons that the school level factors didn't impact was that actually the variation within the classrooms is so great within a given school. So we're not talking about, this is a really important point, we're not talking about good schools or bad schools in design terms. We're talking about good classrooms or poor classrooms in terms of learning. And so if you're a designer, you should be designing really good classrooms, every single one, and combining them into a school. That's inside out design. And if you're a teacher or a head teacher, you should be looking at each classroom with your staff or as a member of staff and saying, how can I improve this particular room? And one of the reasons that that can happen, and I won't go into this, is orientation. You can have the same classroom, one of them pointing where it gets the sun and causes glare and overheating, and another where it doesn't, and suddenly they're different classrooms altogether. So you have to take each classroom on its own terms. Okay, so there's that. And now we're on to looking at a different experience. So having finished this project, looking at UK schools, we were asked to apply it to schools in Norway to give them any insights we could from that study. So that was an interesting exercise, and we looked at 3 schools, and one in particular, this one on the left, was a new school, which they said was the model for schools they were going to build in the future. So they're particularly interested in our results there. So we did this study and we used the same criteria, but of course we couldn't measure the progress of the children, so we couldn't do that type of approach because we didn't have 3 years to do this. And we got some surprising results, really, because do you remember I said it's about sensitivity? The moment you know that individualization, level of stimulation and the like might be important, you start to notice those things. Until you say that, then they can go unappreciated, if you like, or not taken into account. So in this particular school, the level of stimulation you can see in this slide on the right here, this picture on the right, is really quite low. It's quite a boring classroom, to be honest, you've got to say. At least the floor's got a bit of colour to it, but in general, there's nothing going on there. And we said this to the Norwegians, and they said, yeah, well, one of the things is there's no material on the walls because we've got an agreement with a contractor that maintains it that we won't put anything on the walls because it damages the paint. And you think, no, come on, this is a learning space. You should be doing what's good for learning, not what's good for the contractor, keeping it maintained. So these spaces, we think, have an inadvertently low level of stimulation. They're really, really dull. And the moment you know that it's important, maybe you do it differently. Furniture's very high quality. Oh, I've got to say, in defense of the Norwegians, the air quality, the temperature control, all of those naturalness factors were brilliantly done. I've never seen those, and that's because they've got really clever systems using heat pumps and a whole balanced sort of approach to the ventilation of the spaces. So they're brilliant in that respect. We then looked at the issue of ownership. So these schools have a big classroom, 2 smaller classrooms, 2 even smaller classrooms, and there's supposed to be team teaching happening across these. It's supposed to be done really flexibly. And we did a meeting with them afterwards, and we said, but does that really work? Because in terms of ownership, you couldn't imagine any child feeling they owned any of these spaces. They felt connected with them. And they said this quotation that's given there, which was a really neat quotation, actually, which is, if everyone owns everywhere, then nobody owns anywhere. And it's a really interesting dynamic with trying to have flexibility, but also trying to provide ownership of spaces to people. And I'm not saying there's a simple answer, or even if I know the answer, but it's a really interesting dynamic where if you're trying to maximize on flexibility, be careful you don't lose out on ownership, because it'd be very easy to do that. There was in this school a mismatch with the pedagogy going on. They wanted there to be team teaching. They wanted there to be a transparency through lots of windows into the classrooms. And the teachers were the teachers that used to teach in a traditional school. And they didn't like it really. They hadn't got their heads around it yet. And they may well have done by now. But at the time, they basically just divided the class, which was supposed to be one big class taught by a team, into three, put them in the different spaces and taught them as small classes. So that wasn't really working too well. And one last thing on this, which is that we wondered about the space, the size of the space issue. So the classrooms in Norway are literally three times the size of the classrooms in the UK. And so we thought, well, is that an advantage? And okay, it's only indicative, but this is a picture of a classroom where the teacher is there with the children in the far corner. I don't know if you can see. They're not using most of the classroom. And so we then interviewed the teacher and said, what's going on there? Why are you all stuffed up in the corner there? And he said, well, if they're all spread around the classroom, it's a nightmare for me. I spend all my time running around the classroom, trying to interact with them, and it just doesn't work. And so it made us think, and this is another question it raises rather than any answers, that maybe there's a sorry, my clock's chiming. Maybe there's a psychological distance between teachers and children that has to be maintained. And if you get too spread out, maybe it just doesn't work. So it's an interesting proposition that you can perhaps have a classroom that's too big. And maybe what you should be doing is using it as associated spaces where you can do quite different things rather than just as a big open space like that, which would have cost a lot to build. Okay, let's have a look. Taken for granted aspects then. So this is me just being trying to be a bit humble. I'd done this study. I was pretty sure about what we were doing and what was important. And then I did a big review with Alberto for the World Bank, looking at the evidence on learning spaces and their impacts across the world. But this would be including Africa, India, and all the countries of the world as far as we could. And it made me think, what an idiot really I am, because there were so many taken for granted aspects that we didn't even measure, we didn't even think about, because we have them. We actually have electricity, we have water you can drink, we have sanitation, we have a telephone, the waste is dealt with, all those things which certainly in the UK we take for granted. And aren't we lucky? But in lots of places you can't take those for granted, and there's real evidence that they make a big impact on the learning spaces, on the learning of the children. And we saw this to some degree in Romania, for instance. We've done a study in Romania where in some of the rural schools they don't have these things either, and so it can be really problematic. And one of the big things at the bottom there is dampness. If the school is damp, which is quite a basic thing to do with building construction, quite easy to get damp schools, then that has big negative impacts. And so these are the sorts of impacts that came out with that. Quite a lot: violence, discrimination, limited opportunities to learn. That's the one we're particularly focusing on. And then the dampness in particular led to a lot of absences and illness, which meant people were missing school. They just weren't getting as much school as they should. Of course, that's the children. We then also looked at the evidence and how it affected the teachers, and similar studies, but slightly different things. So same thing really, though. Building in good order, good condition is a major one. School library, electricity, toilets and the like. And what we found with them is that the impact on teachers was really great on their health and their motivation. And this is, do they even want to turn up and teach? And in some countries, they were having real problems with getting teachers into the profession. And then once they got them, getting them to turn up regularly to do the teaching. And what they found in one particular study was that when they addressed these sorts of factors and made sure the schools were in good order, then it had a more powerful effect on retaining teachers in the profession than salary levels. And you can understand that really, because if every day you're having to go to work in a space that is really uncomfortable and unpleasant, then you're going to say, I don't want to do this. And whatever you pay me in the end, you probably want to do something else with your life. So very important impact there on teacher retention. Okay, I've talked for ages about all of this. I don't know how we're doing. But I'm going to move on now and talk about these other aspects a bit more quickly. So this one's looking at what happens if you're the person in charge of a whole estate. It might be a country, it might be a region of buildings. And this was a study we did of the 27 countries in the EC. Experts in each country extracted information about how they manage their school infrastructure. We created case studies, and then from those we came up with an idealized model. And this was through an iterative process. And the iterative process looked a bit like this. From the initial pass on the data, this sort of process was going on. It's a linear process where there's a strategic assessment on the left, and then you go through to transparent investment criteria, and then you move on to collaborative implementation processes, and hopefully out of the other end you get smart, effective, inclusive investment and spaces that are good for learning, among other things. So that's the simple linear process. But then we looked at the places where they were really successful, and the picture got a bit more complicated, but you don't have to worry about the detail of this. The thing to notice is the arrows going backwards, the blue arrows going backwards. Suddenly this became a dynamic system. Instead of just building things, they also got feedback from how they worked, and they fed back what schools they had into their inventory of school premises, so they could actually work out where they needed to invest more. And they had really smart demand modeling, looking at the population growth and so on in the longer term on the left-hand side there, compared with the schools that they had bottom left there. So it became a dynamic system. This might sound like a small thing, but it's not, because from the cases where people had done really well, they'd exploited a characteristic of these dynamic systems, and that is it doesn't matter where you start. If you start anywhere in this system, you pick somewhere where you've already got some existing strength and build out from it, then eventually you get to deal with all of the issues. And so that's an interesting opportunity, I suppose, for you to look at your systems and say, where are we strong? Now let's build out from there and try and make the system more comprehensive. And this is what they did in those successful countries. They started somewhere, and you could call it the art of muddling through. What have I got here? Disjointed incrementalism. It sounds bad. It sounds a bit unmanaged. It's quite pragmatic, but it's with an overall thrust over the long term. So this, we're talking about beyond the political cycle. We're talking about 5, 10, 15 years worth of effort where people have consistently tried to just add bits to how they approach and improve what they're doing. So the only other thing to say is that there is a gap in the middle between the strategy and the implementation at the project level, and you have to be careful how you deal with these. And this is a good point for me to say. At the bottom of all these slides, there's a link to cleverclassroomsdesign.co.uk. That's not a selling link. All of the reports I'm mentioning are on that link and freely available. So if you want to actually follow up any of the information, please look there. Okay, I'm moving on now rapidly because we can't be too long. And I'm going to look briefly at this. This is a thing where a publication in the US has drawn international views on learning spaces for several years now. And this was a compendium of the last 5 years' work, and I was asked to edit it. And I did a bit of a stern job on it, to be honest. And the publisher was a bit shocked by how critical I was of some of the stuff in there. So I did tone it down. So this is the toned down version. And what you can say is that there are lots of specialist perspectives in there. And these are people who really, really believe what they're saying. So this is heartfelt advocacy. And it can be things like physical activity is really important. We have to keep pupils moving. It could be things like innovative learning environments are really important. They have to be the way forward, or learning should be play. Anything else is dreadful. So these people really believe what they're saying. So I'm not saying that cynically even. I know they believe it, and it's really great they do. But they also twinned it with this thing at the bottom left, which was a really strong antipathy to traditional education. It's like demonized. It's in inverted commas. They use words like industrialized or coercive drudgery. And by this, they meant somebody standing at the front of the classroom talking to the pupils. Now, that might be a bit limited as an approach to teaching, but it's not as bad as they're making out. And so that, for one, was, I think, a danger. You tend to get camps of people talking about new, interesting, innovative things versus old, boring, bad things. And I don't think it's as simple as that. I think you have to be much more nuanced in terms of how you assess what you're doing and how well it works. And if you do move from one to the other, you definitely should do it in an evolutionary way rather than just trying to crash through in too rapid a way. This was became clear because the other thing they talked about a lot was the role of the teacher. Actually, that's not true. They didn't talk about it a lot. The teachers were hardly mentioned in this. This was mainly about designers and advocates for innovative ways of teaching. With the teachers, what they said was, generally speaking, slow to adapt to new spaces, as though they're idiots. You know, they're given these new spaces and they don't realize how lucky they are. They should be doing something different. Well, to my mind, the teachers are the professionals when it comes to teaching, and maybe we should be listening to them quite a bit, and maybe we should be trying to provide them with what they need and want to teach in the way that they want to teach, which could be different, and it may be the space is constraining them at the moment. So that's a real point, but it shouldn't be a matter of the teachers are idiots and don't actually understand how to use this space. That is a silly stance, and seeing them as an obstacle to progress. You know, they're negative views about the teaching profession, where I think if we're talking about building schools, we have to be, they're the client. We have to be really working alongside them, and then there's massive synergies that we can actually get out through that dialogue. The other thing that came out was that because of all these different heartfelt views about spaces, people are presented with a whole load of things which actually aren't possible to do at the same time. And so really, as I say, we've got to think, I think, in terms of evolutionary change. And the thing that came through really clearly in one paper is what I think is an excellent suggestion is adaptive management. So this is actually experimentation. You try a change on a small scale, you learn from it, and if it works, you do it some more. If it doesn't work, you adapt it and change. So real world experiments, try learning, adapting. And that's a good way forward, I think, rather than actually trying to impose a massive change on people because they don't understand this is how they should be teaching. I'm going to give you an example of experimentation, and that being done rather sort of smartly at one school. So this is at Haberdashers. This is one of these posh boys' schools in the UK. And they saw our initial results, and straight away they thought, let's try this out, because they were refurbishing their library. And so they applied our initial results, which were actually quite different from our final results, but to try and get more natural light in, to try and actually provide more stimulation in terms of color and shapes, and to provide flexibility, try and get some curvilinear spaces in there as well. And so they did this with their library, and they say the library is now a dynamic, vibrant, effective learning space, which is well used and appreciated by boys and staff alike. And you could think they would say that, wouldn't they? Because this is something they did, and they're bound to make it sound good. But they did something really smart. So this is the space before, and you can see there are rooms round the edge there, cubicles, which keep quite a lot of the light out, actually. And it's a quite traditional library with somebody at a front desk, and if you're lucky, you can get past them, and if you're very lucky, you can touch a book. And they changed that completely to a place that you can just move into. They opened out the edges of the class to let the light in. They provide lots of different seating opportunities, groups, ones and twos, lots of access to different technologies. And that looks nice. But then they did an even smarter thing, which is that they measured the level of usage of the space. And this is a library, so the children don't have to go in the library. And the red lines there are the use of the library at lunchtime. And you can see that the use has doubled. So as a measure of that space being successful and attractive and working, you can see it's actually really really worked very well. Okay. We're now going to move on and spend one slide on the teacher's perspective. It doesn't seem enough, does it? But this is a dialogue with a teacher about what the head results, that's the clever classroom stuff I talked to you about, look like from the perspective of a teacher. So from the perspective of a teacher, they're actually looking for different things in a space. They're not looking for level of stimulation, individualization. They're looking for, are the children engaged? Are they alert? Are they included? Independent, creative? That's the sort of things they're looking for in relation to the impacts. And so the dialogue we had was about how does that connect with the ideas from the head project? And what came out was really interesting for me anyway, which is that our study was over a year. It was looking at quite a static view of a classroom, and their perspective, the teacher's perspective, was actually that's fine, but let's look at level of stimulation. It depends which time of day, which pupil, which activity, which subspace of the classroom. She had some autistic children where, you know, they had to be in a particular place at a particular time of day to do particular things. And so the level of resolution is much finer, much more dynamic. And we're talking about teachers having to almost play the classroom like an instrument to try and get the most out of it with lots of different pupils with different needs. So that was an interesting insight for me of what it really looks like from a teacher's perspective. I'm checking my watch. I'm on the last bit now, but I'm going to truncate this so there's time for questions. Is that right? Would you like me to do that? I'll carry on. So this is about
no, everything is fine, Dr. Barrett, so please continue. You are still in time.
Okay, good. This is just very quickly, before I look at the case study of implementing change in a classroom, this is very quickly looking at a review of building schools for the future in the UK. This was a very large multi-million-pound project, national project, building secondary schools, and each one was supposed to be a statement. And most of them were led by visionary heads who had really interesting ideas. And these were 5 schools, A, B, C, D, E. And you can see that in terms of getting an alignment with the vision of the people driving the development, it was quite difficult apart from in the first case, A. Quite often it got lost in the design realization. This is the interaction with the designers and the budget and the cost savings that were necessary. Quite often it was lost in relation to the interaction with the rest of the teaching staff because they actually hadn't bought into the different approach. And quite often it didn't impact on the pupils in terms of anything tangible for them. The bottom case is a bit of a sad one, really, which is that this was quite a successful project and then it was cancelled at the last minute, and so it didn't happen. Whereas everybody was on board and everybody was ready to go. So that was a shame. But it's just saying that actually maintaining the vision right the way through and making sure the vision is something that's owned by all of the stakeholders is really quite difficult. And just having the vision of one person is quite dangerous because generally speaking, what happened was these heads left after a couple of years, and these were brand new buildings, and they started knocking down walls and building new walls and changing the configuration with real building work, which shouldn't be necessary after only a couple of years. So let's look at the case study. This is Trumpington Park Primary School. This is a case study of an incremental sort of change going on, a really carefully done one actually. And they wanted to change how they taught, and they wanted to do that by changing the classroom a bit. They wanted to move to learning by inquiry, so a bit away from the teacher being at the front, although in the UK, the children sit at islands of tables, typically 4 or 6 pupils together, and they do a variety of things. They do group work, they do individual work, but they also do whole class work. But they wanted to move farther than that into a much more sort of, a much more pupil-led and organic approach to learning. And they had the flexibility for this because it was a new school that was filling up from the bottom. And so they had some spare classrooms which weren't full yet. And they targeted year 4, where there's not a lot of assessment going on, so not too much pressure. And they had 2 teachers who shared the teaching, and they got very involved in the process. The only slight complication was that COVID came along just at the time they were going to do this. And so you can see that there were lockdowns and there were all sorts going on. But the amazing thing was that they decided to carry on with the process anyway. So it delayed them a bit. We had the initial discussions back in, February 2020. And then things went quiet a bit until September. And then they decided to get moving again. And so we had a series of workshops. You can see 5 workshops there. And these involve some facilitators, the 2 teachers, and I was there with my wife observing the process just as an objective view and recording what happened. And we then interviewed lots of different people and we tried to create a sort of record of it. And you can see the first 2 meetings were face-to-face, and after that we weren't allowed to meet. And so we had to do all the meetings virtually. So it was a difficult process, it really was. And over those months from October 2020 up until December 2020, these workshops were really quite extensive efforts, and they were mainly focused on issues of school ethos, pedagogy, how you want the school to be, how you want the learning to be. They weren't a lot about designing the classroom, to be honest. But then suddenly, towards the end, there was a rapid design push of a few weeks. Furniture was sourced over Christmas. And then by February the next year, the furniture was in. And then they were constrained again by COVID. They couldn't put the whole class together. They had to just take small groups into the new classroom, and then half the class and then the whole class. So the whole process was really made quite difficult by the whole COVID thing. But they managed it, and it's a credit to them that they managed to keep going. This is a table showing the workshops. I'm not going to go through this in any detail, except to say it was a process which was pedagogy-led. It was a matter of how do we want to teach? How do we want the pupils to learn? And that was the emphasis. And then they talked about atomized bits of furniture, but they had to justify to the facilitators why that bit of furniture would actually support what they were trying to do educationally. And then they started to put together sort of priorities about the furniture. And then suddenly something good happened, which is, here's the existing classroom on the top left. It's not a bad classroom. And then suddenly this diagram appeared from the teachers. They basically suddenly turned up to a meeting and said, this is how we want the classroom to be, which if you're a designer, you'll say is the most scrappy, awful diagram you've ever seen. But if you'd followed the process, what you knew was that the teachers had suddenly taken control of it. They'd suddenly owned it, and they were going to actually push for what they wanted in the space. And they understood what the impact of the different furniture they were going to get might be. So this is really important. You know, it might not look impressive, the diagram on the bottom right, but it's a significant step in the process. And then that diagram, now the top left, was quickly linked to the schedule of furniture that they'd identified. And then that was quickly linked into the design on a piece of paper in the middle there, which is only a bit better than the previous one, for how the classroom would be. And then after Christmas in February, here's your new classroom. So the process of actually implementing was very quick, but it was preceded by months of discussing what it was going to do for education. And as a result, they could move quickly because they understood where they were going. So the moving in process was difficult. I'm not going to labor this. It turned out to be really advantageous, though, because they could spend time experimenting with the children, doing different things, and the children really got to grips with how the classroom was intended to work and really got to like it, so that when they moved in as a whole class, they were ready to actually behave differently, because this is mainly about behavioural change, actually, in relation to the children. And here's the children in the space. They're using it very differently. They could sit where they wanted. They could move around from lesson to lesson. They could form groups in different ways. They had these tables that you could write on, which the teachers weren't at all sure about, actually. They said, I think it's a good idea, but let's wait and see. We think they're getting a mess. But actually, they turned out to be very positive as well. I'm going to mention a few things looking at this so I don't have to spend too long on the next slide. So on the writable tables, what it meant was that they could actually, the teachers could move around the classroom and help children by just writing on the desk with them. The children could try things out on the desk, and if it wasn't right, they could just rub it out. this sounds like a small thing, but we interviewed the children and they hate getting things wrong in their textbook, but they didn't mind trying things out on the table because it wasn't permanent. It wouldn't be there forever. They could work in different groups. These are triangular tables, one per child to sit out with a chair. They say that if they were feeling the group was getting a bit too much for them, they could just pull their chair back and separate themselves a bit. So they found that really positive. You can see that the teachers moving around, they're not at the front. They're not teaching from the front anymore. They actually have a pedestal so they can teach from anywhere in the classroom if they do want to teach to the whole class. And they found that really effective. And this, I won't emphasize the left-hand diagram picture, but if you look at the right-hand picture, you can see there's a blue recess. This is where they used to hang their coats, but they took this as an extra space. They put an acoustic screen in front of it, and they treated it as an extra quasi-connected space with the main room. And this had a huge impact. What this meant was that the children with special educational needs, there were about 3 of them in this class, didn't have to leave the class with their one-to-one tuition. They could stay in the class and they were part of the class, even though they were being helped independently. And the children who were doing very well, when they were getting ahead, they'd just go into that space to find what extension work they should do rather than asking the teacher because they knew where to go. So this little space made a huge difference by being used in a different way. And it was just being wasted before, really, for coats. So let me just go a bit more quickly. So the children were excited and thought it was more exciting and colourful. They had very nuanced views about the spaces and its potentials. Because they'd moved in phases, they knew what the different spaces could do, and they'd move from one to another to actually get the best for them. So that was pretty impressive to hear. The teachers, I've mentioned most of these things. Yeah. In terms of learning activities, overall, at the bottom there, it was much more about the children's ideas. It was much less about someone at the front dealing with the whole class. And they thought there was much better thinking going on, even if the outcomes didn't always look as polished. And so that was them saying, we're actually investing in these children, we're trusting them. And then we go on to the academic challenges, impacts, sorry. Here, it was very hard to track. It's very hard to track because COVID was having huge impacts on how much time people spent at school. And so we tracked it compared with a parallel class. And basically, the class outperformed itself in the previous year. It did better than the parallel class. It did it in a strange way. So that's an overall finding. These bullet points towards the bottom are showing some individual effects. Because this was a study of a class with 30 pupils, we could talk about each pupil to the teachers. And so we worked out which were doing much better than the average for the class and said, why was that? And they said, well, there are a few children who are now mixing with the more high ability children. And as a result, they're being pulled on. So that's the first bullet point. They were actually doing really well because of that interaction. And then in the middle, we've got a group of children in the class who are really quite social. So they liked interacting with people. They liked moving around. And suddenly that was legitimized. Instead of that being naughty, that's what they were almost expected to do. And so they were thriving in that environment. And at the bottom, there were 2 or 3 at most children who didn't like it, who found it really quite difficult, who found it a little bit too chaotic and not contained and structured enough. And the teachers were working on that. They were trying to work out how they could provide them with the space they needed, but also how they could help them expand out of that fear, if you like, almost of the potentialities of the classroom as a whole and interacting with the other pupils. And then there's a behavioural thing, and the behavioural thing was quite profound. We didn't realise till we looked at a parallel classroom. So in the parallel classroom, the typical approach in the UK is that the children are given some work to do in a lesson. And then after about 5 minutes, the children who are struggling start following the teacher around, asking for help. And then after about 10 minutes or a quarter of an hour, the children that are doing really well say, I've finished, and they start following the teacher around, asking for extra work. They call it extension work. And before you know it, the teacher's being chased around the classroom by a little gaggle of children who want help in different ways. That wasn't happening in this new classroom. And we said to the teachers involved, so did you used to do this thing of being chased around the classroom? And they said, yeah, that used to happen all the time. And we hadn't realized, but it's not happening now. And it's not happening because they can move to the pupils very easily. The pupils are actually helping each other a lot. They're finding that's a really, really common thing now in the class. And the last thing is, if there are pupils that need work, they've got a big round table and they say, go to the big round table and I'll come and help a group of you when I can get to you. So it's completely transformed, actually, the behaviour within the classroom. The challenge for Trumpington is to take that experiment in one class with 2 teachers and expand it to the rest of the school. And the interesting initial thought is that that's going to take more effort than it seems, because you can't just shortcut that learning process that those teachers went through and that ownership that they developed. That needs to happen again with each teacher so they can do it in their own way. So we're going to see how that happens. But overall, this was a great success story, and it's a great lesson really about pedagogy-led change by teachers, supported by people who are actually interested in the spaces. So nearly there, last slide. And the last slide is just stressing some things. So there's strong evidence. This is the first thing. Until we did our study, there wasn't strong evidence. We all suspected it, I suppose, but there's strong evidence that the physical characteristics of the classroom really does impact strongly on learning. The second thing is that you need to look at it holistically. You can't really look at any one bit. You should try and actually maximize out on all of the fronts. And then if you're going to try and implement this at a national or a regional, or even if you just own several schools level, then you need to do that on a strategic basis. You need to take a long-term approach. You can be opportunistic, but you need to have a vision and you need to cumulatively build on the system and improve it. And then stressing this business about engaging with educators. It really has to involve the teachers. It has to be driven by them. I'm from construction. I'd see them as the client. They might not know how to build it, but they know what they're doing and they know how you can help them. And so they need to actually be brought into the process there. And it needs to take time, because you can't expect an answer straight away on what you want. It takes the building up a relationship with the designers. And lastly, I've not said much about this at all really, but spaces have to be designed flexibly. There's a reason for this, which is that actually populations change. There's demographic change, and sometimes you need to expand or contract school. And the other thing is that how people want to teach, pedagogical fashions change, and so the space has to be able to react to that over decades. These things are going to happen over decades, and if you build a school to suit a particular situation, it's going to become a problem at some point in the future. So building in flexibility, really important. And that's me. Thank you very much.